Good evening. Good evening. I was hoping to have a number of students hop onto this call, but I guess I'm going to have to start without anybody on the call. So chapter 8 talks about location strategies, and I just want to talk briefly about the essence of this chapter and then walk us through the quantitative approaches that we have to trying to find the best location for an organization, for a corporation looking to expand its operations to possibly to new states or to new global locations. So I'll briefly talk about what we have in chapter 8. We're going to look at the strategic importance of locations on the location decision-making process. What are the different factors? And then how do you go about quantitatively evaluating from amongst different location or alternatives? I don't think I'll cover the geographic information systems today, but if you have the time, please read this and get to learn more about that as an alternative option. Okay, so what are we going to cover? I'm basically going to look at what are the 7 major factors as outlined in your textbook when it comes to location decision making. I'll briefly talk about labor productivity. And what's more importance to us is these quantitative methods that you'd be required to use to be able to determine what's the best possible location given either how much volume a company intends to move from a specific or from multiple locations to the customers, or how much they intend to receive from their suppliers. Okay, so there's a factor rating method. We also have a locational break-even analysis approach. And then finally, we'll talk about the center of gravity method. Okay, none of these methods are exact methods. They actually rely on a lot of subjectivity, and that makes them less than perfect. But overall, in the long term, they've generally become to be accepted as methods that can be used to help determine what would be the best location for an organization or for a company to set up possibly a new manufacturing facility or a distribution center or warehouse or even our corporate offices. Okay, so one of the main reasons why we have chapter 8 in your textbook is this. Once an organization commits to a specific location, there's a cost, and usually that's a pretty significant cost associated with committing to a location. There's costs associated with the purchase, if it's a purchase of land or property, which is usually pretty significant. There's a cost associated with leasing if the company decides to lease the property. The contractual costs associated with all the legal aspects of that specific decision. So all in all, the decision to set up shop in a specific location is usually a large fixed initial cost that if it's not done right, you end up in a situation where you pump in, say, $100 million into a location only to find that that's not the best location for your corporation. So getting it right the first time around is usually pretty important for an organization, because chances are that once you've pumped in that cost, you really don't want to move out of that location unless there's a better alternative, and the cost to recoup the initial investment can actually be explained away, or can be factored in and justified. Okay. Additionally, when you look at locations now, we compete in a globalized environment, so corporations don't just seek locations within the United States. And so the question that arises is, would it give us a competitive advantage to consider locating a manufacturing location or distribution center or a supplier location outside of the United States? And if so, how do we determine the different risks associated with moving to a location outside of the United States? Because obviously the dynamics are very different, and that becomes something that you have to factor into your calculation. Okay, so it's a process that it's usually a decision that's made not as frequently, but it entails a lot of decision making. It entails usually a pretty significant commitment by the company, and as a result of that, location decisions are usually a strategic decision That's usually decided by those within the organization at the upper echelons of the organization. So there are multiple options that the authors in the book discuss prior to deciding to commit to a new location. An organization can actually decide to look at what they currently have and figure out, do we have the capacity to be able to expand with what we currently have at the same locations we currently own or lease? Or maybe we could consider, if that specific location is not sufficient, then the next step would be to look at what are the alternative options. Should we purchase some real estate, or should we lease some real estate? And if so, where should we consider doing that purchase or lease activity? So it's again, I can't overemphasize this. It's pretty critical for an organization to get this right, just due to the time involved, the costs involved, and again, that decision comes with a whole bunch of other different activities or other stakeholders who have to be factored in. When a corporation decides to open a distribution center, say in somewhere in St. Louis, Missouri, that decision is not usually taken in isolation. You have to consider, how does that impact your suppliers? Okay, how would it impact your access to your customers? Okay, obviously, if you're enough in the services industries where you have to have that visibility with your customers, the closer you are to your customers, the better facility would be. But for the purposes of most manufacturing, being close to the customer and daily contact with the customer is not as big of an issue. So you have slightly more flexibility in terms of where exactly you'd want to site your new location. So it's a big decision. If you ever find yourself put into the role of being part of the team making that decision, I would say it's something that you'd have to go into the decision-making process, just thinking of what are the different ways that the decision could be impacted by you, internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. And in addition to that, what about the macro environment? How do we consider what's happening in the macro environment in terms of trends associated with sales, trends associated with technology and all that? That makes a big difference. Okay, so so that in a nutshell is what are some of the things that you'd have to consider when committing to making a location. Globalization is big. It's not going away. It's something that organizations have to see as something that has to be factored into the calculation of where do we want to site our facilities, where do we want to site our operations, okay? And part of the reason that this is important is we have a competitive system where your competitors potentially would cite the locations that look at in different countries wherever they feel that they would have a cost or a competitive advantage over other competitors. And the actions of your competitors directly or indirectly impact your actions as a business. And if your competitors are offshoring production elsewhere and are able to capture cost savings, that could lead to a situation where you might be forced to consider outsourcing as well. Okay, and if your organization decides to consider staying local, then it makes sense for the organization to then figure out, how do we compete with corporations that have outsourced different activities to offshore locations where the lower cost of labor, lower cost of production might lead to a major competitive advantage. Okay, so we'll talk about some of the approaches to determining that location. That right at the bottom here, we have this key success factors. And in the very first approach that we're going to look at, we're going to look at a discussion of what exactly should we look at when it comes to what are the things that are going to make our decision a decision that's actually grounded in competitiveness, a decision that's grounded in enabling us to achieve the highest possible return from our siting decision. Okay. When you're looking at siting decisions, you can look at them from three levels. Okay, from the highest level, the macro level. I'll almost start from the global level, and that starts off with a decision of where exactly are we going to site this new facility or this new location? What nation should we target? Okay, and that's usually depends on a whole bunch of factors. It depends on market circumstances. Where is your market? If your market is in the United States, chances are that it makes sense for you to have a location close to your market if that would result in the rapid transit of goods from your facility to your customers. Okay, but whichever nation your organization or company decides to site its operations in, there's an element of risk. There's an element of political risk, depending on the nature of the government in place. And that's often witnessed by the decision by most corporations to steer away from certain nations and to not do business with certain nations. Right now, we have ongoing embargoes with a number of countries. I believe North Korea is one. And chances are that they might have lower costs of production and all that, but due to the nature of the relationship, certain nations, certain countries might not even be considered or be put in play because they're just not worth the time to consider. Okay, so based on your market, based on where your suppliers are, and based on the weight of the product that your company manufactures, the organization would be forced to make a decision on that, the site of the location, based on how much does it cost to move that product through your supply chain. Okay. There's also the issue of the availability of qualified labor. That's usually big, and that's for a number of corporations, the decision to outsource manufacturing to less developed nations is not really based on a better quality of labor. It's more based on a lower cost of labor. So that has become an issue that was pretty popular in the past 20, 30 years, but little by little, we see a slow shift back through a process we call inshoring, where organizations start to realize that those low-cost countries like China, Thailand, have slowly started becoming less cheap, or if I use the word cheap, locations to outsource to as the standards of living increase, as people get wealthy, as their middle classes grow, their demand for better wages increases. And as a result of that, you find that companies or countries that were more competitive 20 years ago are not as competitive today. Okay, and that's a good thing for a developed nation like the United States or Canada, because it means that there's a potential that inshoring activities might have a future, where if we have the right combination of labor and technology, we can actually be as competitive cost-wise as a corporation that decides to outsource to a lower cost nation. Okay, so there are different risks associated with the country of choice. There's the last risk listed here, exchange rate, is something that is really, for almost all global corporations, multinational corporations, that's a very real risk that has to be addressed, and would ultimately be a big deciding factor when it comes to where should we actually set up an operation. If we believe that there's a lot of fluctuations in the exchange rates, it might make sense to move operations to a country where we have a market. So we kind of like skip over the exchange rate risks that are inherent in most global trade transactions. Okay, so moving from the global level, we move to the regional level, where once we've set our sights on a specific country, we can now ask ourselves, within this country, where should we set up operations? Okay, and that's usually determined by factors such as infrastructure, whether there are any governmental support systems in place or any incentives by the government to attract your business to a specific region. There's are issues associated with what's the cost of labor in a given region. If we look at this map right here, if I consider sourcing or citing my operations in Illinois as an example, and you look at a city the size of Chicago, which has an awesome infrastructure network, but the cost associated with labor, cost associated with real estate might be pretty significant to the extent that it stops being attractive. So in that case, the person or the persons responsible for making this decision have to consider everything, all the different risks and rewards associated with a given state, a given location. What are the different incentives that are being offered? But beyond that, what are the long-term costs, and what are the long-term benefits or profits that could be expected from a specific location? And finally, once we've committed to that region, then becomes a question of, within this region, where should we set our operations? Okay. So this is the most localized level of decision making. Basically looks at what's cost of land, how much land do we need, and how close is that piece of land or that real estate going to be compared to where our employees or potential employees are going to be, where our market's going to be. What about the infrastructure? Do we have the infrastructure necessary to be able to get our products in and to get our products out to our customers? Okay, so I'm going to skip the Global Competitive Index because I want to talk a bit about the quantitative aspects of site locations. And but in just as a brief summary, the Global Competitiveness Index just basically looks at how well does a country do in terms of its ability to support business operations. Okay, how attractive is a specific nation to a country in terms of things such as the infrastructure available, government policy, political risk, things like the availability of qualified labor. So once all these things are factored in and calculated out, the Global Competitiveness Index ranks countries in terms of how well those countries do in terms of the ability to support business operations. So the US is doing pretty well. It's currently ranked third behind Switzerland, Singapore, which is interesting because these two countries are pretty small countries, but they've managed to achieve quite a bit in the past 50 or so years. Okay, so let's go into a discussion of the quantitative. Okay. In your textbooks, one of the things that you'd find that one of the first calculations is a basic determination of labor. How productive is our labor? Okay. Labor costs factor into most location decisions because the cost of labor is usually one of the biggest costs that companies incur. And our ability to utilize labor and have labor churn out product is a metric that makes sense for companies to calculate when they're trying to determine what's the best location for us to site our operations. Okay, so the labor productivity ratio is basically you look at the cost of labor and divide that by how much product an organization can churn out in a given time period. So if we're looking at the labor cost per day, you'd be looking at that divided by how much output did that labor achieve within that same given time of 1 day. Okay, so the example here that's given in your textbook where you compare production in South Carolina with production in Mexico, we have a situation where, production and labor costs, where the labor costs per day, and that's not just wages, that would be wages, insurances, health insurance, life insurance, blah, blah, blah. So if you lump up all those costs, you end up finding that the costs, well, this is a fictitious example, but it gives you a rough idea. Costs in Mexico are definitely going to be lower for labor than they would be in South Carolina. Okay, but it's possible that with the combination of technology and the same manpower, that the labor in South Carolina can churn out more units than what we have in Mexico. Okay, so that's a possibility. we might have more robots, we might have more technology that could lead to a better outcome at the end of the day. But when you look at the total labor productivity, in this example here, the number of units divided by the cost, you end up with a situation where your metric tells us that it would be cheaper to manufacture product in Mexico than it would be to do the same in South Carolina. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you'd have a greater labor productivity in Mexico than you would in South Carolina. And so that becomes a situation where you might want to consider either one of the two. There's I'm looking at these two figures here, and I noticed there's no, I'll skip that. But anyway, labor productivity just basically tells you how much output are you able to get with a certain given amount of input. Okay. So let's go to I'll skip the clustering of companies. Clustering basically looks at why is it that corporations decide to set up operations right next to their competitors. Okay, and a really good example of this is what we have in Silicon Valley, where we have a whole bunch of IT organizations bunch up together in one really small part of the United States. And the question arises, why didn't they set up operations elsewhere if they're really competing within this IT market space? And the reasons for that usually have to do with synergetic effects. The amount of information generated out of Silicon Valley from any given organization could actually help other organizations within the same region or same part of the United States develop other technologies that could make them even more competitive. So clustering has its advantages, and it's seen quite a bit in a number of different industries. What I wanted to now do is to go into a discussion of the quantitative methods that you're going to have in your textbooks. And the first quantitative method that we have is your factor rating method. And the three approaches we're going to discuss here are very basic. And that's the beauty of them. The ease of calculation of these rating methods enable anybody interested in making a quick decision on locations to compare multiple locations and come up with a solution to what might be the most ideal location based on a number of factors that are under consideration. Okay, so the factor rating method basically looks at what we call our key success factors, and it requires that the people charged with making that decision determine what exactly is it that we need to consider for a location to churn some level of success in certain regards. Okay, so let's look at these two countries that potential fictitious corporation is looking at expanding to. Okay, considering two different locations, one in France, one in Denmark. Okay, and the key success factors that they have here, what they believe will enable them to say that the operations out of this future facility are successful, are pegged to these, how many categories is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories. So they believe that the availability of labor is something, of the right type of labor is something that could help enable them to achieve success. So that's something that would be considered as important. The people to car ratio is something that they would consider important because depending on the nature of the business. The per capita income would be considered important if that determines the ability of customers to purchase the product being sold. And then the tax structure in place, and then other factors such as education and health are considered important too. So once the organization comes up with a set of key success factors, you then assign a weight to those success factors. Okay. So the thing to remember here is that this is subjective. Okay. It depends on what that group of people making this decision feel that is most important to the organization. What key success factor is most important, that'll get the most weight. Okay. And once you've assigned a weight to those key success factors, those weights have to add up to 1 or 100%. Okay. Then you consider each country individually and assign a score to that country. So France, in terms of labor availability, France is given a score here of 70. Denmark is given a score of 60, which tells us that France does a better job. It has more labor available with people who have the right attitude or the attitude that the company is looking for. So in that regard, France becomes potentially a better option than Denmark. Looking at the people to car ratio, Denmark has a higher people to car ratio, so Denmark is better. The per capita income, excuse me, France has a higher per capita income. For the tax structure, France again has a better tax structure. And finally, Denmark has a better education and health system. Okay. So now, once we've assigned a score, these 3 columns right here are actually pretty subjective. Okay. And that's based off of personal experiences of the people on the group making this decision. They would have to assign a score based on whatever mental criteria they have. And once you assign those scores, then you multiply your score by its weight and you come up with a weighted score. Okay. So if you're to do this in Excel, I would advise it's easier. I find it much easier to just do a table and just use Excel, make your life easier. Okay, so they had labor. Let's see, your labor. They had people to car ratio. They had per capita income, and then tax structure, and then education, and finally health, and what? And no, that was education and health. I missed one. Oh, that should be it. Okay, so that assigned a bunch of weights here, 0.25, 0.05, 0.05, 0.1, 0.39, and finally 0.21. Okay, your total must sum up to 1. So go to my auto sum. Okay, and I'd put a different country here. We had France and Denmark. And we're given scores of 70, 60, 50, and 60, 85, 80, and then 75 and 70, and finally 60 and 70. Yep. Okay, so the weighted score just basically asks that you multiply the weight by each country's score and come up with a number. That multiplied by that. Okay, and then I'll drag my formula down and finally sum up both these. And I come up with a score that tells me the higher the score, the better the location. Okay, so in this case here, based on this set of key success factors, I would say that France is a better location for a site for whatever manufacturing operations this company wants to engage in. Okay, so this is just basically the beauty of this is that you can have a list as long as you want and assign a weight to your different key success factors and hopefully capture everything that you believe will enable your company to succeed within that given location. So that's the first method that you can use to figure out given location. Now, one thing that you notice here is that we're not using actual dollar figures when it comes to costs associated with movement. We're not using actual weights. We're just saying, you know what, let's use some key success factors, get a location, okay? Now, let's look at a different approach. Let's look at the location cost volume analysis approach. And here we look at, this is again, another pretty simple approach to determine what's the best location to go for based on costs, okay? Costs followed by how much volume you expect to have at each location, okay? So let's do this in, I have another spreadsheet set up here. And here we have an example where we have 3 locations. Athens, Greece, we have Brussels, Belgium, and then Lisbon, Portugal. And we want to try and figure out what's the best location on the basis of cost. So pretty straightforward, simple calculation where we have both fixed costs and then we have variable cost per unit. And this approach, the location cost volume approach, basically asks you to consider that location that results in the lowest total cost. Okay, so our expected volume here for this new location is going to be 2,000 units, and that will be what we use to calculate our total cost. So for Athens, we have our fixed cost, which is 30,000, and to that we're going to add the variable cost multiplied by your expected volume. Okay, so the variable cost is per unit, so you have to multiply that by the total number of total volume to come up with the total variable cost. And that combined gives you a total cost. I'm going to add some dollar signs here so that I can drag the formula down. You don't have to do this, but I find it easier to just drag the formula down. All right, so on the basis of this, I would say just on the basis of total cost, we have Brussels as our ideal or our optimal location, okay? But we've not yet factored in other things like selling price. We've not factored in how much can we sell out of Brussels and all that, okay? But in this case here, we're just basically interested in what's expected volume, what's the total cost based on that expected volume. And then this is where this approach becomes more interesting. So we have 3 locations here, okay? And each of these locations comes at a cost. This 2,000 units that we have here is a static number, okay? In reality, businesses don't want to operate on a system of static sales. If I was selling 2,000 units for the next 20 years, that tells me that either I have a really static market or I'm not doing anything to increase my sales. So it might make sense for me to consider a location that can support the production of 2,000 units, but I want to have that what if scenario added to this analysis. So the what if is, what if my expected volume moved up from 2,000 to say 3,000 units or to 5,000 units and so on and so forth. That's something that's a very valid what if question, okay? You might have a product that customers find to be appealing, and over time you start noticing some measure of sales growth, and that becomes something that might lead to you considering, how do I grow? Should I now, we started off by settling for Brussels as on location, but would Brussels be the best option if we were to expand our business? Okay, so this brings us to a break-even analysis approach, okay, where we have to calculate what we call the crossover point, okay? What's a crossover point where we start off, in this case, Brussels being what seems to be ideal, okay? But is there a point or a production point where Athens becomes more appealing? Or is there a point where Lisbon becomes more appealing, okay? So for us to get that, we have to get the point where the total cost at Athens equals the total cost at Brussels. And for Brussels and Lisbon, we can also do the same. What's the point where the total cost at Brussels equals the total cost at Lisbon? Okay, so we end up having a situation where we factor in the total fixed cost plus total variable cost at Athens and set that equal to the total fixed cost plus total variable cost in Brussels, okay? And then if we bring the like terms together, 75 minus 45 gives us 30. So 30x equals 60 minus 30, which is 30,000. And so we find that at a level of production of 1,000 units, we are really indifferent between Athens and Brussels. You can set up operations in Athens or set up operations in Brussels. Our total cost would be the exact same, okay? If we had sales any lower than 1,000 units, Athens might become cheaper. We can test that here. So let's test that by changing this from 1,000 to 900 units, okay? And when I do that, you see all of a sudden, Brussels is no longer the most cost-effective location for us to have, but rather it would be Athens, okay? At 2,000 units, we expect Brussels to be ideal. Lisbon seems to have a higher cost than Brussels, but again, for us to figure out what the crossover point, we have to do the exact same thing where we consider we set the cost at Brussels equal to the cost at Lisbon and try and figure out how much production should we have to enable us to have the same costs at both Brussels and Lisbon, okay? And when we do that math, we find that that'll get a level of production of 2,500 units. Okay. So 2,500 units, notice this, our costs here are exactly the same. So 172,500 and 172,500. Above 2,500 units, let's go to 3,000 units. All of a sudden, Lisbon now becomes the better option. So what does this tell us? This tells us that if we want to expand operations and grow the business beyond that initial 2,000 units, much as Brussels might be the cheaper option now, Lisbon might be the better option in the long term. If we think that 2 years from now, we might have orders exceeding 2,000 units or 2,500 units, let's consider setting up operations in Lisbon rather than setting up operations in Brussels, which gives us a shorter term, lower cost, but longer term, more expensive cost. Okay, so that's a location cost volume. It's again a pretty simple method, and it's based on both fixed and variable cost, but it's also based on what your organization or corporation feels the long-term level of production is going to be. Okay, now let's check the last approach, which is a center of gravity approach, which is it's an interesting approach. I like it. It's very easy to understand, and once you get it, it should be very easy to incorporate even within your organization. Okay, so the center of gravity approach basically looks at volume and what are the locations of the different market centers that your organization wants to service. Okay, and tries to find somewhere close or between these different locations that would result in the lowest possible shipping cost or lowest possible distance. Okay, so let's look at an example again. Forget all this. Basically, okay, let me not skip over it. Let's discuss this. So the center of gravity approach requires you to find coordinates to each and every location that you have under consideration. Okay, so you're going to set this on an XY axis and try and find the coordinates associated with the distance associated with a specific location from the x-axis and the same distance from the y-axis. Okay, and let me walk us through this practically. So let's look at this example right here. So I don't have the textbook here with me, but in your textbook you have table 8.5 that talks about the demand for Crane's discount department stores. Okay, give me a second. So we have 4 different store locations in Chicago, Illinois, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, New York, and Atlanta, Georgia. And for these 4 locations, we have a certain number of containers that are shipped to the locations. So 2,000 to Chicago, 1,000 to both Pittsburgh and New York, and finally 2,000 to Atlanta. Now, let's see how we would go about doing this in using the center of gravity approach. Okay, I'll take us back to an Excel file and use my visualization approach. I like visualizing this approach. So I have these locations. I have Chicago over here. I have Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I have New York, and then I have Atlanta. And I have the information from the case here. Okay, the amount of containers shipped per month. And we're trying to determine, basically what we're trying to do is figure out where should we have a location, for example, a distribution center that will service these 4 locations and result in the lowest possible shipping costs. Okay, so in essence, what we're going to be trying to do here is find somewhere, I don't know, somewhere, wherever that'll be, where if I look at the total cost to ship from this distribution center to Chicago, to Pittsburgh, to New York, and to Atlanta, it'll result in the lowest possible cost. Okay, now let's go back to, I'm going to use this diagram here from the textbook, and I'm going to plug it on top of a map here. Hopefully this visualization will make it much easier to understand. Pull these locations so that they overlay the map. So we have Chicago here, we have Pittsburgh, New York, and Atlanta. Now, the center of gravity approach requires you to find some arbitrary origin. It could be here, it could be here. It doesn't really matter where you choose your origin. The result is going to be the exact same in terms of the best location for you to set up your location. So you have some arbitrary origin that you set up. Okay, and when from your arbitrary origin, you're going to have your east-west coordinate and your north-south coordinate. Okay, and this here is usually going to be possibly distances associated with the move. So that could be 300 miles, 600 miles, blah blah blah. Okay, and for simplicity's sake, we have this as 30, 60, 90, 120. That would be 30, 60, 120. Okay, now, the center of gravity approach requires you to get a coordinate on the x-axis. So for Atlanta, from that arbitrary origin we have to Atlanta to the x-axis coordinate, it's 60 miles. Let's assume it's 60 miles. Okay. And on the y-axis, we have 40. So that becomes our coordinate for Atlanta. For Chicago, we have 30 on the x-axis and 120 on the y-axis. Pittsburgh, we have 90 and 110. And finally, New York, we have 130 and 130. Okay, so now we have our coordinates. We want to use those coordinates combined, coupled with these shipping amounts shipped every month to come up with a calculation. Okay, so we're going to come up with this super coordinate, which becomes our ID location, which is arrived at by first calculating the super coordinate for your x axis and then your super coordinate for your y axis. So that should be somewhere in between here. I don't know where it is, but let's calculate that. So how do we go about calculating that? Let's start with Chicago. So we have Chicago. Let's start with the x axis. So Chicago's x axis here is 30. And basically what you're going to be doing is multiplying that 30 by the number of containers shipped to Chicago. So 30 multiplied by 20. Let's go back into our PowerPoint presentation here. And let's do it. Let's see what we have here. So you have your coordinate of 30 multiplied by the amount of containers shipped. And then your next location was Pittsburgh with the x coordinate of 90 multiplied by the 1,000 containers shipped. And then you have New York multiplied by 1,000 containers, and finally Atlanta, coordinate of 60 multiplied by 2,000 containers shipped. You take all that, divide it by the total number of containers shipped, and you come up with your new coordinate for your new distribution center or warehouse or whatever it is you want to set up. Then you go to your y-axis and do the exact same thing. So for Chicago, the y-axis here was 120. The coordinate was 120. You take that 120, multiply it by the amount of product shipped to Chicago, and then you do the same for Pittsburgh, New York, and Atlanta. Divide all that by your total amount shipped, and you come up with your y coordinate. Okay. So once you do that now, you come up with what's called your center of gravity. Okay, the place on your map. Let me superimpose this on my map. Okay, so this then becomes my Chicago. This then becomes what I would consider my ideal location to site a facility or distribution center, warehouse, whatever it is, or a manufacturing facility. Now, this is great in that it enables you to figure out a geographic location. Now, the problem with that could be that that location might be in the middle of Lake Michigan, for example. Okay, so on the basis of this gives you a ballpark, a position where that center of gravity is. After that decision has been made, you'd still have to go back and see, okay, what do we have close to that? Is there a city that might provide us with the labor we need? What about the infrastructural requirements that we have? Is there anything within that vicinity that can actually accommodate that? Okay, so it's still a great approach, especially for distribution management, to try and come up with facility locations that best serve multiple locations. Okay, so that's the third approach that we have, and it's again a pretty good and decent approach to trying to determine where to set up a facility. Okay, so we've looked at 3 examples of approaches, and I wouldn't use these 3 approaches in isolation. I would, if I was to be part of a team trying to come up with the best site location, I would use multiple approaches to try and figure out what's the best location to site our operations. Okay, so that in a nutshell is what chapter 8 is about, and hopefully this provides you information that can help you if you're doing homework assignments to answer some questions on location strategy and site selection decisions. All right, I'm going to end this here, and if you have any questions, please email them to me. All right, you'll have a good rest of your day. Oh, and before I forget, hopefully our basketball team beat Virginia this evening. Keeping my fingers crossed on that. All right, I'll now end this meeting.